Chapter 7 Hell on the Hill. A switch engine belched out a blast of coal cinders that fell into the grass on the west edge of the hill, igniting a small fire. A narrow rivulet of oil overflowing from the lake created by the Lucas gusher was lighted like a fuse. Suddenly the fire slithered to the main body of oil in the flats. Minutes later the lake was afire, with towering flames leaping toward a column of black smoke. The smoke reached a low-hanging layer of stratus clouds and gradually spread over an ever-widening area, enveloping the countryside in nocturnal darkness. Great bursts of flame would occasionally flood the hill in blinding light. Men and animals were thrown into panic. A horseman dashed into Beaumont with the message that hell had broken loose on the hill. A shifting wind overcame more than a dozen men with smoke fumes, but they were rescued by the heroic action of field workers who pulled them to safety. Captain Forney, the Guffey and Galley Field Superintendent, saw the fire moving like a tidal wave toward the east. He saw that the oil lake was doomed and decided that a counter-fire would shorten the life of the conflagration. Jumping into his buckboard wagon, he raced to the opposite edge of the overflow and set fire to the oil there. This created a blaze as spectacular as the first one, and the two towering walls of fire began moving toward one another. As the space between the fires narrowed, a vacuum was created. Periodically, a suction seemed to lift quantities of unconsumed oil high above the ground, where it would ignite by combustion and explode, and the oil would burst into flame like gigantic star shells. The effect was weird and indescribable. The climax came when the two walls of fire met, with an impact that shook the countryside. As this happened, streaks of fire shot up through the low-hanging clouds and then rained down. The main blaze was choked out, but a series of scattered fires continued to illuminate the otherwise smoke-darkened hill. The Negro churches in the vicinity were crowded with frightened and superstitious worshippers. Many left Beaumont that day, never to return. That night, when the excitement subsided, ministers, both Negro and white, met to urge the discontinuation of oil activities on the hill. Their theme was, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof." They predicted dire consequences from this invasion of the Lord's domain, and said that the great fire was a warning. They told their congregations that the town would eventually blow up if drilling were not stopped. The next catastrophe, they said, would be vast underground fires that would burn until the county collapsed. Others predicted that the 4 wells then drilling, if they came in out of control, would submerge the entire coast under a sea of oil, which would ignite and destroy all living beings. This fire was the first of many that the hill would see in the next year. The toll was not great. The Daughtry boarding house was destroyed. Guffey and Galley's long frame building, which housed its 80 workers, was burned to the ground. 3 carloads of lumber and pipe were lost, and Walter Sharp's derrick on the McFadden tract was a casualty. The Hamels had time to move their rig before the flames reached it, and the Beatty, Haywood, and Higgins outfits were not endangered. Probably 1,000,000 barrels of oil went up in smoke and flames, but that was no appreciable loss, as it was unlikely that it would have ever been salvaged and tanked. The great inferno gave the hill a true baptism of fire. Witnesses would never forget that morning of March 3rd, 1901. The fire had its good points as well as its bad. The danger of the lake of oil exploding was gone. It provided more ammunition for the press at a time when things were otherwise at a comparative standstill. The stories were exaggerated into fantastic nightmares. Some reported hundreds killed and injured, although the total casualties were actually confined to horses, cattle, and a few hogs. The Lucas Gusher, while it was flowing, would certainly have been destroyed by this fire, but because the Hamels had covered it with a mound of water-saturated sand, it was undamaged by the flames. Thereafter, waste oil was burned every Sunday at Taylor's Bayou to prevent a dangerous accumulation. Spindletop had neither brokers, promoters, skin game artists, nor the stock market atmosphere of the Crosby Lobby or the Oil Exchange, but it had its own kind of confusion. For instance, the post office was called Guffey, the railroad station was Gladys City, and the oil field was Spindletop. It was after the Beatty well came in that the area started to fill up with job seekers. There were not many wells being drilled at first on the hill itself because land prices were prohibited, but for miles in every direction, derricks could be spotted by the plumes of smoke rising from boilers alongside them. The wildcatters and promoters believed that oil could be found anywhere near Beaumont. They listened to the government geologist who came to town and proclaimed that the entire Gulf Coast plain was underlaid with oil. They ignored Patillo Higgins, who said there would be no oil found except where nature's signs indicated it. One by one, they bit into the dust until finally the land boom was over. That led everyone to the hill, regardless of land prices. Price tags of $250,000 an acre seemed reasonable enough. That was when the hill gained its own population. A town began to grow up around the post office and the depot. The first saloon that opened there, however, was closed the same day. George W. Carroll reminded the landowners that the property would revert to the Gladys City Company if whiskey, wine, or beer were sold on the premises. The situation forced the establishment of a second and more tolerant center of activity. Along the south edge of the hill on the McFadden land, a few hundred feet east of the Lucas Gusher, Clint Grinnell built the Log Cabin Saloon. Within a few weeks, there were boarding houses, restaurants, supply shacks, offices, and saloons. In the back room, on the second floor, or on a balcony of each saloon, was a gambling room. Doors were never closed. Spindletop provided an outlet for the worst as well as the best in men. Cheap prostitutes, both black and white, opened shop around the hill, in tents and shacks, catering mostly to the common laborers, roughnecks, and pipeliners. This competition was met by the Deep Crockett girls, who kept their business alive by riding horseback around the field to make bookings with drillers and pushers. Drillers frequently went to town in parties of 6 or 8 and took over some of the best houses for a night or two. Neither Spindletop nor Beaumont ever reached the depths of degradation that some boom towns of the future were to reach, but it was no tea party. Jefferson County was blessed with better than average law enforcement. Ross Laundrie, the Louisiana-born sheriff, was the town's most colorful Western character. He was fearless, yet he was moderate. He didn't set himself up as a dictator, and he didn't try to impress people with his reputation. Landry was naturally colorful. He wanted as much law and order as possible under the circumstances, and he succeeded quite well. He was a tall, angular man with a broad, handlebar mustache and a grim countenance that could melt easily into a friendly smile. He wore fancy boots, a white hat with a broad brim, and 2 pearl-handled pistols that he was capable of using when the occasion demanded. Because he was firm and yet tolerant, he was highly respected. Landry would let things go so far, and then he would crack down. In that way he kept the situation fairly well in hand. He finally put a temporary jail on the hill because he thought it unwise to try to navigate the 4 miles to the courthouse after dark with prisoners in a buggy, and inhuman to chain men to a tree for the night. The hill was a working man's realm. The men with their names on the leases and the paychecks would come out during the day, but it would take a blowout or fire to get them out at night. The hill was unpleasant. Slimy, black, oil-soaked earth, normally 3 feet deep in mud, was a constant invitation to a pratful. The dudes who visited the hill were the sightseers, the curious, the excursionists, and the slick promoters who would lead droves of suckers off trains and across the field to look at the gushers. They made their visits short. When things settled down to something like normal, there were 3 distinct living areas. The most popular was on the McFadden land, around the log cabin saloon. Men with families chose Gladys City, where the rough stuff was held to a minimum, and a drunk was bound to wind up in the arms of the law. South Africa, across the tracks to the east, was where the Negroes and Mexicans lived. It was populated by the team drivers, tank builders, and ditch diggers. Before long, the hill became fairly well organized. It had everything except a church. There were Sundays when the Reverend Mr. Smart, from George Carroll's Baptist Church, would hold services in a store. The response was never good, but the opportunity was there. There really were no Sundays in the field. Every day was the same. Men worked 12 hours out of every 24, and one day was like any other until payday, and the few days after, when the hospitals and morgues would fill up with the casualties from the wild spending sprees. It was a hell on a hill. Its water couldn't be drunk even when it was boiled, because it was full of sulfur. It was as bad on bellies as it was on boilers. Water brought $6 a barrel, while oil was 3 cents a barrel, a practical application of the law of supply and demand. Tents and long wooden sleeping shacks called bullpens dotted the hill. Every man had a place to sleep and eat. It wasn't good, but it was cheap. A cot in a tent or bullpen usually cost 50 cents a week. Meals at Fuller's or Tobe Hahn's restaurant cost 30 cents. An 8-course dinner was 40 cents, and a whole chicken pot pie with all the trimmings was 75 cents. The chicken pie was the favorite dish of the gamblers and promoters. Spindletop was the birthplace of a new breed of men. Most of them didn't know any more about an oil well than a mule knows about a holiday. If they got off the train in Beaumont, got their lungs full of sulfur gas and the oil spray from the hill, didn't flinch when a stray hog knocked them down on the streets, stood their ground when the promoters and money-mad boomers jostled them, and were able to stand the ride to the hill, they had passed the first test. Things got tougher on the hill, but those who came through Beaumont without getting on the next train to go back home were initiated. Once on the hill, they got the second degree. Usually they started off with a fight over a cot, stood by while someone got shot, or almost drowned in a mud hole. If they stayed 2 days and 2 nights, they had what it took. They came from the farms and ranches, and from the towns and cities. Most of them were native Texans or Louisiana Acadians. But there was a sprinkling of others. You could spot a West Virginian by the bag of mail pouch on his hip, or a Pennsylvanian by the Pollock stogie between his teeth. They were there with their experience, but it was not very useful. They brought cable tools and found they wouldn't work. They had to learn about rotary drilling. The attraction on the hill was twofold. First, the wages for inexperienced helpers were from $2 to $3 a day. That was twice the average pay for labor anywhere else. Drillers, who were the aristocrats, got from $5 to $15 a day, depending on their skill and background. Then there was the lure of working in a place the whole world was talking about. Men were fascinated by the crack of the bull whips, the bark of the exhaust pumps, the roar of the wild well, the clink of poker chips, and the whirl of the roulette wheel. These men were sons of pioneers, endowed with a love of danger and hard work. Most of them came for the adventure and the money, but before many days passed, they had oil in their blood and knew they would never make a living any other way. Just living on the hill was a gamble. It was an arena of action where men were shot, knifed, and beaten to death every day. Even the timid who avoided the fights had their chance to die. Occupational dangers involved death by fire, gas, falling, or stopping something that was falling. It was an experience not unlike that a combat soldier finds in battle, and it welded the participants together in much the same fraternal way. Most of the hill workers were single and between the ages of 17 and 25. The few older and married men were usually the skilled workers or the superintendents and foremen. These men were here and they would stay, not necessarily on the hill, but in the industry that was being born here. Those who could stand the gaff would become drillers, contractors, independent operators, and even executives in the large companies that would push monopoly off the American scene and replace it with competition. It was on this hill that a well borer first became known as a driller, a skilled helper as a roughneck, a semi-skilled helper as a roustabout, and a beginner as a boll weevil. It was here, too, that a spouting oil well was called a gusher, and a cable tool driller first heard himself referred to as a rope choker. Old-fashioned mule skinners learned to answer when called hardtails. Spindletop was opening new ways of language as well as thinking. It was on this hill that a shoestringer would pourboy a hole down by splitting his interest with his crew, the landowner, the boarding house, the supply house, the saloon keeper, and sometimes the madame at his favorite bawdy house. Many times when he finally brought in a gusher, he found that he had little or no interest left for himself. No one knew much about the rotary drilling rig, yet it was the only instrument that could dig into the quicksands, rocks, and gumbo of the hill. There is no record of cable tools ever starting and finishing a well there, and there were few men outside the Hamels, the Sharps, and the Sturms who knew much about rotary, and even they didn't know too much. This led to the use of initiative and invention by almost every serious-minded man in the field, regardless of his job. It was the dawn of a new day in production techniques. It was also the beginning of a new spirit of mutual respect and cooperation among the men in the field. Weeks passed, and derricks went up everywhere on the hill. 3 particular spots of unusual activity were created by the sale of infinitesimal tracts of land to promoters in the Hog Swain, Keith Ward, and Yellow Pine districts. Higgins, Guffey, Haywood, Lone Star, and Crescent, National Oil and Pipeline, and others kept the wells sparsely spaced on their tracks, but the promoters were drilling to satisfy stockholders. There was never any oil sold from 90% of the wells. Oil that was sold went for 3 cents, $2 less than Pennsylvania oil prices. Still, not one wildcatter let this economic obstacle stand in his way. This was a new kind of oil for which there was no market. It was the beginning of an industry. The stock money was not entirely invested in vain. However, in the long run, the stock buyers and promoters were unwittingly providing millions to finance feverish activity and work which would train and condition an army of men for the oil conquest of the future. Contractors hit a bonanza. They found operators who knew nothing about oil, but who were willing to pay as high as $10 a foot for wells. One such contractor made enough money to realize an ambition he had long cherished. He bought a barrel of Guggenheimer whiskey, had it delivered to his tent, and proceeded to drink all of it. He died on the most glorious jag any man has ever known. Hardly an hour passed when someone didn't yell "fight." It was the signal for a gathering of all unoccupied hands in the field. They were seldom disappointed. The fights were beauties. The participants enjoyed them as much as the spectators. Usually the gladiators would beat one another to a pulp, and then saunter off arm in arm to the nearest saloon, where the loser would set up the crowd. The nights were equally hilarious. The log cabin saloon was the scene of as many as 6 or 8 fights at one time. In fact, they were so commonplace that only the most violent attracted attention. Jack Hunter, the chief bartender, would occasionally fire a shot out a window to break up a bloody battle. Gunplay was not too frequent, but it was usually started by some 2-bit gambler or a weakling who couldn't stand the pace. The gunmen got the silent treatment from the men in the field and eventually left when they found themselves ostracized. The law was virtually powerless to handle many of the cases, except where actual murder was involved. Most of the gunmen were gamblers or sharpies of some kind. The Texans were usually quiet farm or ranch boys who resorted to shooting only as a last resort. Easterners were largely responsible for the fact that Negroes did not work on the wells. They contended that Negroes had not worked in the fields in the oil regions, and they believed they would prove a nuisance in Beaumont. There was no great objection to this by anyone, especially the Negroes, who had no particular desire to defy death in a dozen ways every day. There were ample openings for them, but they preferred driving teams, stacking pipe, building tanks, and digging ditches, to working immediately over a drilling hole. Inexperienced help working around boilers accounted for numerous explosions, some of them fatal. Escaping gas sometimes caused derrick men high above the ground to lose their senses and fall 50 feet to the derrick floors. The hospitals were constantly filled with men blinded by gas. As the derricks increased in number, the dangers increased. One day a party of New York newspapermen were guests of a group of promoters. 3 gushers were turned on for their benefit, and one of them sprayed a nearby boiler, igniting the oil. Within a few minutes, the journalist had a story. They couldn't have dreamed up. A gusher burst into flames, and the sight was phenomenal. It was the first flowing well that had caught fire. For a half-hour the entire field was endangered, until one of the workers devised a long-handled wrench and succeeded in shutting off the vertical valve. At 4 o'clock on the afternoon of June 24th, a Guffey well blew out and tore everything in its way to particles. There was a terrific roaring noise as gas and water shot into the air. The heavy drilling rig was lifted off its moorings and hurled to one side. The derrick was torn to splinters, and 400 feet of pipe shot more than 2,000 feet into the air. Gassed men fell all around. By 11 o'clock that night, the wild gasser bridged over and choked itself out. The rig, derrick pipe, and hull were all totally lost. That was the first major gas blowout in the field, but there was no fire. Nothing in the way of equipment that wasn't nailed down was safe in the field. Some called it borrowing because everyone participated. The practice was condoned and charges were seldom filed. There was considerable thievery, however, and one so-called supply house dealt principally in stolen goods. The tank car shortage was a vexing problem. The Southern Pacific got a corner on them, and for some time enjoyed a commanding position. The Haywoods once demanded some type of transportation. A harassed clerk for the railroad sent them 4 box cars. The Haywoods were dismayed, but made the best of the situation. They filled the cars with oil and returned them to the railroad with the complaint that they would not hold oil. Of course, after that, the boxcars wouldn't hold anything and were destroyed by the company. An outstanding demonstration which typified the courage of men of the field came in August of 1901, when lightning struck a Haywood tank that was being filled with oil at the rate of 1,000 barrels an hour from a nearby well. Lightning ignited the gas that was escaping from a vent on top of the tank. A tremendous blaze shot above the tank, but the oil was not ignited due to the strong force of gas pressure. The foreman chose to continue rather than cut off the flow. The fire was kept above the tank, but it shot more than 100 feet into the air and spread wildly at the top. 4 roughnecks and roustabouts from other wells saw the danger, rushed to tents for blankets, soaked them in water and mud, and smothered the blaze. Even a slight slip of anyone's part could have blasted them all into eternity. Located as it was near a forest of derricks, the property damage could have mounted into the millions of dollars, and hundreds of lives would have been in danger. The most dangerous trick of horseplay came to a sudden end in August. It was the custom of some drillers to initiate boll weevils by making them ride the rotary, which usually made them ill and sometimes resulted in injury. A big German boy from a farm in central Texas was given the treatment and injured his back. A few hours later he returned to the derrick with a 6-shooter, quietly ordered the driller onto the rotary table, and let him spin until he collapsed from exhaustion. That was the last recorded instance of the rotary riding trick. Wanton waste was indulged in frequently by the promoters, to the utter disgust of the oil men. One day in September, more than 15,000 excursionists and visitors from over the country cluttered up the field. A dozen gushers were turned loose for their entertainment and inducement. It was on this occasion that several of the promoters, apparently under the influence of liquor, started gambling on how high their respective wells would spout into the air. The workers in the field seldom knew who, besides the contractor, they were working for, and cared less. They had no fear of being fired because they knew they could get another job the next day. Moreover, when they were fired, they got paid. Otherwise, they were paid only once a month. In spite of the fact that the off-the-hill territory was found to be unproductive, rumors of imminent discoveries kept coming in. 2 phantom wells showed up in 1901. A man with a pair of binoculars in Port Arthur claimed he had seen a gusher halfway between the Sabine Lake and the field. It turned out to be a tall tree standing in front of a newly painted white house. The most exciting rumor of all was one about a gusher at El Vista, the Guffey shipping station south of the hill. Tom Woods, a most dependable contractor for Guffey, reported it. He said he saw oil spouting over 100 feet into the air. Captain Lucas reasoned that it might be a secret operation. He had every reason to rely on Tom Woods. After a 2-day search, nationwide news coverage, and great local excitement, a pumper for Guffey at El Vista reported that the pipeline had broken temporarily and that the oil had shot high into the air. That solved the mystery, because the break was in the exact spot where Woods had seen the oil shooting up. The first year in the field was a rough one. It brought wealth to many, and it impoverished many more. It made men, and it broke them, but out of it all was born an industry and the men to man it. Chapter 8. The Onion Patch. Boys, she measures exactly 217 and 4/10 feet, and there's not another well in the field that can touch her. Scott Hayward was talking. He had just made an exact instrument measurement to determine how high the Haywood No. 2 was spouting. It was the greatest gusher in the world, up to the morning of June 1st, 1901, and since that date no one has challenged its superiority. The day before that, the Kaiser Kelly well in the Bullock Survey, north of the hill, had been abandoned as a duster, and off-the-hill land had fallen in value from $50,000 to $2,000 an acre in 24 hours. Most people now took it for granted that oil would not be found anywhere except on the hill proper. Significant incidents were commonplace on the hill between 1901 and 1903, but it would be difficult to point out three more meaningful occurrences than those which happened within a week of one another, unless the Lucas Gusher itself is considered. First of these was the Kaiser Kelly dry hole. Next was the Champion Haywood No. 2 Gusher. The third happened a week before, and its full importance was not recognized until the impact of the first two had settled on the hill. It was the transfer of the J.M. Page 15-acre lease from the J.M. Guffey Company to the Hogg Swain Syndicate. The Page tract was the only lease Captain Lucas had been able to get on the hill outside of the Big Gladys City and McFadden Kyle Weiss leases. Why Guffey permitted it to get out of his hands is anyone's guess. It might have been because the titles were clouded, and Willie Campbell of the syndicate had the key to clearing the clouds, or it might have been that Guffey considered $180,000 a fantastically high price for the mineral rights. Guffey had a well being drilled on the land when the deal was made with the syndicate. The syndicate purchased the hole and the drilling contract along with the mineral rights. They paid Page $105,000 for the surface rights and settled certain claims to clear the title with others. The entire deal cost them $310,000 on the basis of their good names. Members of the syndicate, including ex-Governor Hogg, James M. Swain, W. T. Campbell, A. S. Fisher, and Judge R. E. Brooks, had pooled most of their assets to finance the undertaking for $40,000. They still owed $270,000. This for a tract of land Page had purchased for $450 in 1897. With a $150 down payment and 2 years to pay the remainder. Before this deal, Swain, without knowing about the Lucas lease or the claims against the land, had been negotiating with Page to form a $2 million corporation whereby Page would have received $500,000 for his land. Lawsuits discouraged prospective investors, and that deal fell through. With every other landowner on the hill refusing to sell at any price, Hogg hit upon the idea of getting out from under the $270,000 by selling off part of the tract in small blocks. The first sale was for 2 1/2 of the 15 acres for $200,000. The whole debt was then wiped out when the Texas Oil and Development Company paid $50,000 for 1/20 of an acre, and Judge Brooks and Associates purchased a 1/24 of an acre for $15,000. From that point on, the syndicate was on velvet. The syndicate members made tremendous profits in the next few weeks, selling parcels of land in quarters, eighths, sixteenths, and 32nds of an acre for small cash payments, and the remainder out of oil. The purchasers formed companies and divided up their already infinitesimal holdings to confuse the situation further. The syndicate never sold more than half of its 15 acres, but about 5 acres were cut out of the Keith Ward tract and George Carroll's Yellow Pine tract in Gladys City to add further zest to the boom. Actually, only a few acres were involved in the 3 islands of jammed-up derricks. Whatever caused Guffey to sell the Page lease, whether it was to get hog into the field or as protection against Standard and for political goodwill assurance, it was a monumental mistake. The resulting frenzied drilling program ruined the hill economically. It caused prices to drop to 3 cents a barrel, and hundreds of unnecessary holes dissipated the reservoir energy, resulting in the early end of flush production. Because they held 90% of the leases on the hill proper, Guffey and Company suffered far more than anyone else from the Hog Swain plan. Guffey blamed Lucas, but the Mellons blamed Guffey for the tragic error. The error was tragic, that is, for Guffey and those who had the other 80 acres on the hill. It was the Hog Swain deal, however, that caused the drilling boom that gave hundreds of men the opportunity to learn the oil business from the ground up. Furthermore, it was the demand for oil built up during the period of overproduction, plus the sudden cessation of gushers, that inspired the mad search for other domes. Had Lucas succeeded in his efforts to cover the dome with leases, or if the Page lease had not come under the syndicate's control, it is likely that there would have been no uncontrolled drilling boom. There would have been no Hog Swain, Keith Ward, or Yellow Pine districts on the hill. It was these 3 districts that gave the hill its tremendous boom. Without them, there would have been no cause to drill hundreds of wells, where a handful would have sufficed. Without them, the money would not have been forthcoming to finance the Spindletop University of Roughnecks and Roustabouts. Every wildcat and legitimate company that could afford land on the hill got into the play. Within a few months, wells were so thick in the districts that they looked like 3 newly filled toothpick holders. Between the districts were great open spaces with no more than 1 well to every acre, or 2. Patillo Higgins looked on the site and said the old hill looked like an onion patch. That was what the workers called it thereafter. The hill continued to prosper. Its tremendous activity soon affected every section of the nation. There was hardly a county in Texas where experts were not looking for oil. Activity in California increased. States where the subject had never been given a thought before were being explored. Alabama was considered the area most likely for the next strike. Louisiana, free of antitrust law nuisances, was attracting a big play. Colorado had a boom. Lucas was prospecting in Kentucky, South Carolina, and Georgia. John Galley probed in a half a dozen other states. Texas was surprised when the Houston Oil Company was chartered for $30 million. The company's incorporators were S. Bronson Cooper of Beaumont and Joe Eagle and H. F. Bonner of Houston. Cooper and Eagle were members of Congress. Newspaper headlines implied that John Henry Kirby, fabulous East Texan, was the guiding spirit behind the deal. Kirby was a promotional genius who later became the lumber king of the Southwest. He lived a Horatio Alger life, born in the backwoods. He was 13 before he saw a railroad. He was still picking cotton and digging potatoes at 19 and could barely read and write when Bronson Cooper made it possible for him to get into Southwestern University. That was his first schooling, but he completed a law course there by the time he was 23. On the same day, the Houston Oil Company was formed. The $10 million Kirby Lumber Company was chartered. Later, Kirby revealed that he was the largest single stockholder in the Houston Company and the owner of the majority of the Kirby Lumber Company stock. The Houston Oil Company immediately purchased a large block of stock in the Higgins Oil and Fuel Company. This gave new prestige and financing to that company and made it one of the important oil companies for the next 30 years. As the onion patch grew, important things happened. Guffey started building a refinery in Port Arthur. Jim Sturm found a new oil sand at 960 feet. The price of oil dropped to 3 cents a barrel. The small companies tried to amalgamate, but were denied the right by the Attorney General's antitrust law ruling. An organization of raiders known as the White Cappers flourished for a few weeks until Ross Landry could cope with the situation. The Klan-like organization made the mistake of taking a prisoner out of Landry's jail one night, and he saw to it that its activities subsided after that. In October, the greatest gasser the world had ever known came in on the McFadden tract. The pipe shot more than 1,000 feet into the air and spouted water and 30-pound rocks, creating a new interest in gas as a fuel. In November, the Guffey Company loaded the Cardium, the first oil tanker to call at Port Arthur. It took on 60,000 barrels of Spindletop oil that had been desulfurized to prevent explosion. The Beaumont Journal reported 79-pound pressure on a Palhamas well and stated that it indicated a serious drop for the field in October. The very next day, the Yellow Pine No. 10 gusher came in with 349 pounds pressure, recorded on an improvised gauge. The hill was as mischievous as its founder. Higgins had been in his younger days and about as unpredictable. Interest lagged somewhat in the field for a couple of months due to the 3-cent price and the absence of a market for fuel oil. In December, however, there was a new surge of activity. Guffey's announcement that high-grade commercial gasoline could be made from Spindletop crude was big news. No one stopped to think that there was also little market for gasoline. When the end of the year came, there were 138 gushers on the hill, and 46 rigs were digging feverishly for new oil, and still there was no big market. It was estimated that $235 million had been invested in oil in Texas due to the boom, most of it in spurious companies, and the year-end report revealed that $4,371,000 had been invested in wells and facilities, not including land and leases on and around the hill. Considering that Standard Oil was capitalized for $100 million, the Texas oil investment was significant. One interesting part of the first year's report was that $294,000 was invested in 84 rotary well drilling outfits. 50 years later, that would be the approximate price for one such outfit. The second year of Spindletop's operation was celebrated around the bars on January 10th, 1902. The 2 months before had been the biggest in the field history, with 20 gushers in November and 22 in December. But this month would top them all. Walter Sharp set a record by drilling a well in 12 days, even after spending 2 days in hard rock. St. Patrick's Day brought the field its greatest hilarity. The Irish had a field day. The Orangemen and the Sons of Southern Ireland squared off for the greatest free-for-all fight for fun in the history of the Southwest, at least. When it was all over, the landscape was decorated with bleeding noses and black eyes, but everyone was happy. The Irishmen retired to the saloons and drank to Old Aaron. As the days went by, drilling continued, but low oil prices were strangling all except those such as Higgins, Haywood, National, Lone Star, and Crescent, Guffey, and a few others, who had storage pipelines and markets. In January, gushers were sold at from $18,000 to $20,000, and in early February, the oil exchange was the scene of a disturbing incident. R.W. Griswold, a broker, announced on the floor that he would sell a gusher in the Yellow Pine Tract for $8,000. The offer was immediately accepted by John D. Cameron of the Equitable Company of St. Louis. Cameron had, only a few months previously, purchased 5 million barrels of Spindletop crude to be delivered over 5 years. That purchase had contributed more than anything else, probably, to increased activity in the field in December. The oil exchange officials were infuriated over the newspaper accounts of the sale. The local newspapers defended their right to report the news and confirmed the sale. The gusher was located on a tiny parcel of land, 10 by 12 feet. This was a far cry from $1,250,000 National Oil and Pipeline had paid to Dr. Beatty for the second gusher 10 months before. It indicated the panic of some of the small operators, but it presented an inaccurate picture. Gushers were still worth many times that amount. On the same day as the $8,000 gusher sale, the price of oil was advanced from 9 to 10 cents a barrel. That was the typical inconsistency of the Hill. In February, also, 2 other important developments came to light. The French Navy announced that it would use oil from Spindletop in the form of briquettes. This was followed in 2 days by the announcement that the United States Navy had asked for a $20,000 appropriation to finance tests with a view toward using Beaumont oil. George J. Gould returned to New York with great and glowing reports of the Texas situation and pictured the Gulf Coast as the industrial center of the future. He immediately backed up his words by ordering the International and Great Northern Railroad to take immediate steps toward equipping its engines for fuel oil to replace coal. There was unpleasant news with the good. Dallas insurance underwriters warned the Houston and Texas Central Railroad that insurance would be canceled wherever large storage tanks for oil were built. The MK&T reduced freight rates on coal 15% in order to combat oil competition. The L&N then reduced freight rates from $1.75 to $1.10 on the haul from Mobile to New Orleans. to try to keep its coal-carrying business from vanishing. In May, there was real consternation in the field. Most of the wells stopped gushing. This was immediately attributed by some geologists to the Central American earthquakes. In that same month, 300 oil companies operating in the Beaumont area lost their charters when they failed to pay franchise taxes to the state. This, plus the drastic oil reservoir pressure drop, had the immediate effect of boosting the price for oil to around 20 cents, due largely to the activities of such men as Charles Wallace of the Higgins Company, a former Galveston grocer. The market for oil was improving. There were some dismal days, but wells kept coming in, and prices for leases, although lower than when the small parcels first went on sale, were inordinately high. They would fluctuate, however, with reports of oil showings in wells off the hill. As such reports got warm, the hill prices went down, but as each of these proved to be either sheer promotion or unfounded enthusiasm, the Spindletop land prices would go up again. The hill was still capable of producing more oil than anyone could possibly use. It was the general feeling, however, that one well off the hill would destroy Spindletop's land values, but it never came. Beaumont, in the meantime, was taking a serious blasting from critics throughout the country. Hundreds who foolishly lost their money in the wildcat stock schemes were bitter. The coal barons who were reeling from oil competition, the railroads of the East, which were afraid of losing their coal-hauling business, the Standard with its tentacles reaching into most of the industrial and financial institutions, and oil men who failed to get a foothold on the hill, were behind the attacks. Not only was the product castigated as a farce, if not a menace, but Beaumont itself was described in bitter terms. The town was bad enough, with its mud, murders, overpopulation, saloons, deep crocket, gambling dens, and uncontrolled scenes of wild speculation, without exaggerations. None of this deterred the steady march toward the development of refineries, pipelines, and other facilities necessary to an industry. Beaumont had oil to burn in spite of anything the skeptics could say or do. Its oil had solved the problem of cheap fuel in America. Sometimes the critics used the argument that there was too much oil. Beaumont was inclined to go along with that argument. 3 barrels of oil had the heating quality of a ton of coal. Coal was priced at $350 a ton, and its equivalent in oil at 20 cents a barrel was 60 cents. That was only the heating cost saving. Other advantages were equally important. Liquid fuel offered high heating power, small bulk, cleanliness, and economy. Furthermore, it offered ease of manipulation under pressure and tremendous savings in labor and maintenance. The Southern Pacific Railroad, the first large-scale user, announced that it had saved $5 million in 1 year using oil. The coal barons were being forced to release their stranglehold on American industry, particularly the railroads and manufacturing enterprises, industries that had for years been forced to drag their weary way, existing, as it were, instead of profiting by capital and time invested, could now see the light. The mechanical, industrial, and motor development potential was unlimited. The fuel problem was no longer without a solution. Spindletop meant the unleashing of industrial and mechanical possibilities that the world had never dreamed of before. A dramatic demonstration of the value of oil was announced by British shipping interest. The number of stokers had been reduced from 100 to 4 on a typical steamship by using oil. Passengers' business had increased with the elimination of soot and foul smoke. Ship movements were increased by the fact that oil could be loaded on a ship in hours by one man, where it took days and 100 men for coal loading. Cargo space was increased considerably by the elimination of coal storage space. On the other hand, the lignite coal business of Texas, which was at the time beginning to blossom, was set back to such an extent that it has never revived. None of the significant occurrences or press reports were a cure for petrophobia, the excitement which gripped all men who got close to a gusher. The teeming activity of the hill was slowed down only by the rain, mud, and fires. Even then, 8 mule teams were equal to the situation. The gas got worse as the days went by, and it was not uncommon to see mules keel over and die from the fumes. Patillo Higgins contended that there would be deeper oil on the hill. In 1902, Jim Sturm decided to find out. He made plans to drill a well deeper than the sand, just below 1,000 feet. In fact, he planned to go to 2,000 feet or more, if necessary. There were some who doubted the Higgins theory, but they kept quiet. The well was unsuccessful because it was impossible to get through the highly charged oil sand to the required depth. Years later, the Higgins theory was proved correct, but the sands were on the flanks instead of on the hill itself. Beaumonters coughed through the night on November 13th. The odor of oil and gas was strong enough to keep them awake. The next morning they found their houses yellow with oil mist. A dense fog, wafted by a steady breeze from the Gulf, had floated thousands of barrels of oil in minute particles from the field to the town. The ground was covered with a thick coating of oil. Not a house or building in the community was left unsprayed. The oil film over the town was not unusual, but normally it was very light. One incident in 1902 served to confirm Patillo Higgins' advice to Lucas. The C.E. Jones Development Company brought in a gusher in Lot 44, on the exact spot where the original Lucas well collapsed, after finding oil at 575 feet. The well was in the area where Higgins recommended drilling for the Gladys City Company, within a few feet of the railroad tracks. It was drilled for H.A. Pearlstein, the town's blacksmith, and R.M. Mothner. From Pearlstein's profits would come Beaumont's first skyscraper. Spindletop raged with a fire for a solid week in September, when the T.J. Woods well ignited from a cigar carelessly discarded by a driller. The well was gushing high above the derrick top when the flames reached it. There was no chance to close it in, as valves had not been installed. The fire was an awesome spectacle, colorful and belligerent. It marked the first use of steam and sand in fighting fire. In late October, the Hog Swain tract was completely wiped out by a series of fires. 26 derricks and pumping units were destroyed in the first blaze, but few wells were lost due to the fact that most of the valves were closed and the well heads covered with sand before the flames reached them. The fire started when a small wooden tank in Block 38 collapsed and the oil spilled over a boiler. Among the gushers lost were the Lucky Dime, the Live Oak, and Wild Gusher wells, which turned into blazing fountains of oil. The wells lost were all located on less than an acre of land. This fire was almost under control when the second started in another section of the Hog Swain tract. As a workman lifted a lantern to blow out the light, The gas fumes ignited and set off a tremendous blaze. A roughneck trapped between walls of fire in the first few minutes of the excitement was burned to death. Wooden derricks, some 75 of them, were quick fodder for the inferno. J.S. Corbett's giant settling tank caught fire and added to the spectacle. Hundreds of citizens joined the field workers in battling the flames, but by the next morning the Hogswain tract was a smoldering ruin, a shabby sight for a train of excursionists to see. There were no gushers for the promoters to show that day. The last burning embers of the blaze were cooling when lightning hit a Guffey tank during a thunderstorm. The flames leapt to an adjoining tank and carried on to the thick patch of wells in the Keith Ward tract. Great walls of flame, a pall of smoke, and flashing lightning combined to produce one of the weirdest spectacles of Spindletop. Hundreds braved the heavy storm to climb the hill and watch the fireworks. Lightning struck a number of installations on the hill, including a Negro church in the South Africa area, where a funeral was being held. A mourner killed by the lightning was the only casualty of the day. The heavy rain drenched the fire. Its waters created a blinding steam that choked off the flames. When the 12 days during which the hill was a constant hellfire finally came to an end, only the Yellow Pine district stood intact. Work was started rebuilding, and in a few days little evidence of the destruction remained. The Safety Committee, however, issued a field ruling that as soon as wells were completed in the future, derricks would be removed, and brick housing of the type introduced by Lone Star and Crescent earlier would cover them. This ruling destroyed the picturesque onion patch effect, but it gave new protection to millions of barrels of oil. By October, there were 440 gushers on the hill. In the 3 districts, they were spaced on an average of 20 wells to an acre. There were millions of barrels of oil in storage, and field rules forced those without storage to hold their oil. The gusher for fun and promotion days was over. The bugaboo of low pressures was almost forgotten when a well in the Keith Ward tract came in December with a deafening roar and a new record in pressures. A few days later, the Yellow Pine No. 10 came in, and the pressure gauge recorded 200 pounds. A pipeline gauge was attached, and the needle went around to 340 pounds. That was 3 times the pressure of the Lucas gusher. Again, the old hill had confounded its critics. As the year ended, the demand for oil was steadily increasing. It was being used in locomotives, sugar mills, factory furnaces, breweries, residential stoves and heaters, ships, smelting plants, and on roads. Power plants began using oil, and the age of electrical power started a tremendous expansion. At Sulphur Mines, Louisiana, the answer was found to the greatest problem in producing sulfur: oil as a fuel. Enabled Hermann Frosch, the sulfur genius, to get the fullest benefit of this hot water production method. Coal, wood, and other fuels had hampered Frosch, but now oil provided the perfect answer, and another of the world's greatest natural resources could be obtained in quantities sufficient to provide for the abundance that was to come. It was the day after day of excitement of new gushers that continued to increase the Spindletop tempo. For Captain Lucas, the sight of his gusher coming in was almost enough. All that followed only helped to complicate his life. First, there was the Higgins suit, then the sale of his interest to the Guffey Company, and now people were urging him to run for governor. Beaumonters had shown their appreciation to the captain by presenting him with a Tiffany-produced Medal of Esteem. It was a solid gold watch charm larger than a silver dollar. On one side was a replica of the Lucas Gusher, with the derrick in tiny gold bars, and inlaid onyx depicting the oil shooting over the crown block. The capacity of the well was stated at 53,700 barrels, a figure that was low, but probably as correct as any other used. On the reverse side was a 5-pointed star with the word Texas spelled out in the spaces between the points. A large diamond was in the center, and smaller diamonds tipped each point of the star. The inscription on that side was Beaumont to Lucas, from 100 friends. The captain heard several speeches at the presentation. Men said that his great success had come in the face of opposition, discouragement, and ridicule, which was somewhat concealed out of admiration for the man's perseverance. A few days after that, an Englishman stepped up to the captain and said he wanted to make his own presentation. "I heard about your well the day before it came in. I was in Calcutta, and the international dateline favored me," he said. "I rushed here, and in a few days I made $200,000 thanks to you." The captain was so astonished when he was handed a large diamond scarf pin that he did not even learn the donor's name. The man from Calcutta boarded a train and was gone. Lucas was the name everyone identified with the Beaumont oil discovery. Higgins was lost in the shouting. John Galley, the man whose persuasion had sent Guffey to the Mellons for the money, was scarcely mentioned. Higgins and Galley were too busy to be bothered by an absence of recognition. Even Carroll and O'Brien, the men who first gave encouragement to Higgins, were forgotten in the concentration of praise on Lucas. The captain was a modest man, and the excitement plus the acclaim was too much for him. He accepted Guffey's offer to look at other prospects, and went to a dozen areas in Texas, then to Kentucky, Georgia, Alabama, North and South Carolina, and Louisiana. Wherever he went, he was met by the curious and the well-wishers. The preposterous stories that he had made $40 million caused people to want to see him. His trip was virtually a triumphal procession, and every acre of land he visited went up in value many times. One morning, the Atlanta Constitution carried a most fantastic story. It was a mournful sob-sister, rags-to-riches treatment. Lucas was described as a former railroad conductor whose wife had come to the Constitution office with 2 little boys several months before looking for her husband, Captain Anthony Lucas, a conductor on the Georgia Midland Railroad. Nothing had been heard of the captain, the account related, and it was assumed he had vanished, until the great Lucas Gusher came in. Now it continued, he was rolling in wealth, while his wife and children were still struggling to exist. The canard was copied by the Birmingham Telegram and forwarded to the Chicago Record-Herald. From there it was picked up by other newspapers and some magazines. It turned out that the conductor Lucas was another man, who at the time the story was written was back with his family in Montgomery. Months later, journals and magazines, usually highly regarded for their accuracy, such as the National Oil Reporter, continued to circulate the story. The captain was not bothered as much by that, however, as he was by an article that reported he was certain that oil would be found in Charlton County, Georgia, because he had found the rare oil bloom growing in profusion. It quoted the captain as saying that the flower was a definite indication of oil. When he first read the story, he was amused and reared back in uproarious laughter. Suddenly he stopped and realized what so ridiculous a statement might do to his professional reputation. "Good Lord, I hope none of my friends read this as coming from me," he said. "They will think I've gone crazy. How in the world could a flower indicate the presence of oil?" He rushed out of the house to the newspaper office to make a correction. But again the harm was done. One by one the newspapers and magazines picked up the story. The denials always flowed, but the captain never got over his embarrassments. He felt that fame had too many penalties. Lucas returned to Beaumont in September. He stayed a few weeks, but soon tired again of the boom, which was worse than ever. He was a scientific man, and the hectic confusion, the lawsuits, the promoters, and the mud and mosquitoes were more than he cared for. He left one day late that year and returned to the scene of his great accomplishment only once more, 2 years later. His trail had led him around the world and eventually back to his Washington home and office. Lucas was confident oil would be found on Spindletop's flanks. He said, however, the world would have to wait until equipment was developed which could penetrate the necessary depths. Petillo Higgins had his own ideas, and they did not fall into the groove that accommodated those of his partners in the Higgins Oil and Fuel Company. He didn't like selling the majority of the stock to the Houston Oil Company, so Higgins sold his own stock and retired from the company. He had an idea bigger than all of his former ideas combined. Petillo Higgins decided to form a Standard Oil Company. A Standard Company was regarded as one which would produce, transport, refine, and market the product. Texas had no such company, and there was some doubt as to the legality of one under the state's antitrust laws. The Higgins Standard Oil Company Limited was chartered in November of 1901 and came into existence publicly early in 1902. The president was Petillo Higgins. His associates included D. Call, president of the Beaumont National Bank, and I.D. Polk, a realtor, and Higgins' friend of long standing. Other directors included capitalists from Lake Charles, Houston, and Lawrence, Kansas. The most elaborate promotional brochure ever produced for an oil company was made up. It was 11 by 14 inches, buckram bound, and contained 72 pages with stories of the company, its promoters, anticlinal pressure, the origin of the oil, dozens of pictures and illustrations, a chapter on the story of the Beaumont oil field, and another titled "Nature Paints Her Own Signs." Major gushers in the field were shown in full-page photographs. The company was capitalized for $10 million. And stock purchasers were given an opportunity to buy $100 par value certificates for $50. Higgins said the stock was being sold for half its value and that the company's holdings were worth 5 times the capital stock. In the introduction he wrote, "I have made enough money to retire from business and keep me in a sumptuous way all the days of my life. I am not selfish, therefore a retired life would not suit me. I want to live for the good of others. I have a talent for big things. If I hide my talent, I'll be responsible for the things which are left in darkness and not developed." Higgins announced his intention of building a large refinery in Houston, and another across Sabine Lake in Cameron Parish, Louisiana. His company had 155,000 acres in fee lands and 42,000 acres more under lease. He called Spindletop Higgins Oil Field number 1, and then spotted Higgins Fields number 2, 3, and 4. The second great field, he said, would be 23 miles east of Houston at Barber's Hill. The third would be located on the Cameron Parish lands, and the fourth in San Augustine and Sabine counties north of Beaumont. A network of pipelines would connect all of these fields. He said other fields had to be developed, otherwise Spindletop, due to the abuse it had received from promoters, could play out and leave all oil companies in a critical condition. For the company's letterhead, he adopted the one used by the original Gladys City Company with modifications. The picture of little Gladys, who was now one of Beaumont's most beautiful belles, was left out. Gushers were placed on either side of the industrial layout. There was also a tank steamer and a tank car, each labeled Higgins. In the story of the Beaumont oil field, Higgins lowered the boom for the first time on all his fellow townsmen. He called them 2x4-headed Beaumonters, and he said of his directors in the Gladys City Company, "If we wanted to go to New York from San Francisco, we would have to ride there on the bare backs of long-eared jackasses without bridles." The full measure of his wrath, however, fell on geologists, particularly the government breed. He devoted almost a page to a diatribe against these learned men of science, as he called them, by concluding that there are many geologists filling high positions who ought to be out on a farm making rails and following behind long-eared mules. Patillo Higgins' proposed company failed to materialize. Some said he devoted too much space in his brochure to condemning others for things that would have been better forgotten. But the most likely reason his company failed to raise the necessary capital was that the wildcat promoters, chiselers, and stock scheme artists had disgusted the nation with oil stock. A few months before, his Standard Company stock would have been in greater demand than any on the market. When the venture folded, Patillo Higgins, in a philosophical mood, said all wasn't lost. He said he had been able to get a few things off his chest, and that had been troubling him a long time. And anyway, he said, 50 years later, those mosquitoes in Cameron Parish would have eaten me alive, and I would be dead, like most of those men who were great successes in the Beaumont oil field. The work involved was too much for one man. One feature of his brochure was worth the thousands of dollars Higgins put into his company and lost. It was the reproduction of a letter giving him full credit for the discovery and development of Spindletop. The testimonial was signed by 32 of Beaumont's most prominent citizens. Among them were W.C. Averill, O.B. Greaves, J.F. Keith, M.K. Fletcher, J.C. Ward, Congressman Bronson Cooper, W.B. Dunlap, John N. Gilbert, C.T. Heisig, I.D. Polk, R.M. Mothner, Leon Levy, John H. Brox, and a half-dozen others who made fortunes as a direct result of Higgins' persistence. The document was attested to by the county clerk on December 3, 1901, and it gave the story as completely as it would ever be told. The document read as follows: "To whom it may concern, this is to certify that we, the undersigned citizens of Beaumont, Texas, are personally acquainted with Patillo Higgins of this city. We have known him for many years, and believe him to be perfectly reliable and trustworthy. He is a native of Beaumont, Texas. We know within our personal knowledge that Mr. Higgins discovered the Beaumont oil field in the year 1892, and he said when the field was developed that it would be worth millions of dollars. He said that single wells would flow thousands of barrels of oil per day. He located the exact spot where all the big gushers are now found. Mr. Higgins organized a company in the year 1892 for the purpose of developing the oil field, which he had discovered, and he styled the company Gladys City Oil, Gas and Manufacturing Company. His company bought a large tract where the big oil gushers are now found, and they contracted with a well contractor to have a well drilled to a depth of 1,500 feet. On account of the well contractor being unskilled and having inferior machinery, he drilled the well to a depth of 300 feet and could not go any deeper, and he abandoned the work. Mr. Higgins tried to get his company to make other contracts to drill wells, but he could not influence them to do so, and confusion arose among the directors, and the company remained in idleness for a number of years. Mr. Higgins bought lands individually in the oil field and commenced to induce others to go in with him and develop the oil field. He finally made a contract with Captain A.F. Lucas to come and develop the field, and Captain Lucas came and commenced drilling, and he brought in a well on the 10th day of January 1901, and the well was called the Lucas Well. Mr. Higgins deserves the whole honor of discovering and developing the Beaumont oil field. That admission of facts and establishment of credit was worth more to Patillo Higgins than a dozen Tiffany medals. It was the first and the last recognition his fellow townsmen have ever given him, but it was sweet recompense for years of toil, heartbreaks, and disappointments. The prophet had found some measure of honor even in his own home country. Chapter 9. Guffey Goes Golf. To tell the story of how the Mellons got into Spindletop, it is necessary to go back to that midsummer morning in 1900, described in Chapter 3, when John Galley introduced Captain Anthony Lucas to Colonel James N.M. Guffey in the Pittsburgh offices of Guffey and Galley. Captain Lucas has a revolutionary idea about the possibility of oil on salt domes, Galley began. I have looked over his prospect and am in agreement with his theory to some extent. There are surface indications of oil on the land he has under option south of Beaumont, Texas. The location has the advantage of proximity to tidewater that isn't enjoyed by any other field in the United States, or so far as I know in the world. Guffey listened to Galley with the respect and the attention he always paid to his recommendations, and then asked Lucas more about his theory. The captain explained at length with intelligence and enthusiasm. He told of his first well and the oil he had trapped before the pipe collapsed in the hole. Then he explained his various efforts to get a new test financed, and the type of deal that he could make with the Gladys City Company. Guffey sat back a few minutes to contemplate. As they sat there, Captain Lucas was intrigued by this man. His name was known throughout the oil world, along with that of John Galley. He was a picturesque figure with long, white, curly hair, blue eyes, and a healthy, ruddy complexion. His features were almost delicate. He wore a Prince Albert coat, a dazzling waistcoat, a handsome pleated shirt, with a wide lay-down collar, and a Windsor tie. The wide-brimmed black felt hat resting on the desk completed the ensemble of this Pittsburgh version of a Western dandy. The one incongruous note in his otherwise faultless attire was his uncreased trousers. Guffey Lucas thought was a strange type of man to be associated with the modest, quiet Galley, but probably they formed a balanced team. He knew that by reputation Guffey was a shrewd promoter who did things on a grandiose scale. He was obviously a combination exhibitionist, politician, and capitalist. Guffey studied Galley's map of the Texas prospect and commented that there was no oil production nearer than Corsicana, some 200 miles away. Finally, he seemed satisfied in his own mind, apparently having worked out a plan of procedure. "I'll make an appointment with A.W. Mellon of the T. Mellon and Sons Bank," Guffey said. "This afternoon we will know what we can do. I would not start such a project without sufficient funds for 3 wells, storage, and transportation facilities. If we start, we must assume we will find oil. The amount I will want, about $300,000, may be hard to get. Naturally, Mr. Mellon will want to know the details. I propose a partnership," Guffey continued, "based on 5/8 interest for myself, a quarter interest for John Galley, and the remaining 1/8 for you." He was talking directly to Lucas. The captain said that he had hoped for a better arrangement for himself. "Captain Lucas, this proposition has been turned down by the Standard Oil Company, the people of Beaumont, and everyone else you have approached. Furthermore, state geological officials and the United States Geological Survey have condemned it outright. In addition to that, 4 holes have been drilled, and your jar of oil is the only tangible result to date," Guffey said. "This is a risk I would not consider under any circumstances, were it not for John Galley's faith and recommendation. You have had your gamble and lost. Now you have a chance to recoup your losses and make a profit on my gamble, depending on what we find. If you want the deal on that basis, I will present it to the bank that way. It is your decision to make." Lucas could not answer this argument. Every point was taken. Whether he did or not, he could have recalled that less than a year ago he had given Patillo Higgins even less interest in a proposition which involved scarcely 10% of the amount Guffey proposed to spend. Guffey was not interested in the deal Lucas had made with Higgins, stating that such a deal was purely the captain's personal worry, and not the partnership's. Lucas was disappointed, but he had no alternative. He accepted the Guffey terms. Galley left such matters entirely in Guffey's hands. As far as he was concerned, that was Guffey's part of the business. He understood that the colonel was proposing that the prosperous partnership of Guffey and Galley would borrow the money from the Mellons, and in effect lend it to a new and separate partnership of Guffey, Galley, and Lucas. The Mellons had respect for Guffey, particularly since his partnership had been highly successful in recent years. But they based their loans entirely on Galley's reports. They not only considered John Galley the greatest oil explorer in the business, they regarded him as a friend of the family. They were happy, however, that Guffey was the businessman in the partnership. Andrew Mellon heard Galley's ideas on the prospect in Texas. backed by Guffey's opinion that the project was well worth the risk involved in view of its nearness to tide water. If we should hit oil at Beaumont in sizable quantities, which John thinks highly probable, Guffey said to Mellon, there would be no limit to our opportunities. I prefer that no one know that we are behind this venture, however. We intend to let it appear that Lucas is continuing independently with borrowed money. Guffey said that if the loan were made, he would urge complete silence as far as the Mellon Bank was concerned. Mellon said that if the loan were made, of course, that would be understood. It was later in the afternoon that Guffey and Galley returned from Mellon's office, with the good news about a loan had been approved. The details were all that remained. The partnership of Guffey, Galley, and Lucas was formed under the name of the Guffey Petroleum Company. Within a month, Galley had made arrangements with the Hamill brothers to drill, and then went to Beaumont himself to stake location for the first well. He took to this task like an old bird dog, heading for good quail country. Galley was born near Cherry Run, Pennsylvania, in 1840, from almost the very day that the famous Drake well came in as America's first commercial oil producer. He was in the business. He was far too active in the search for oil to be annoyed by the Civil War. It was in the 60s that he discovered the famous Maple Shade Well in Pleasantville. Even the fact that Lee's armies had invaded Pennsylvania did not turn him from his task of seeking new oil. Galley probed the earth around Clarion, Armstrong, and Butler counties, and followed the scent of oil to Stump Creek Island, where he discovered oil in the middle of the Allegheny River. There his famous Island Queen, Island King, Mellon, and Andrew Wells, the latter named for his friend A.W. Mellon, are still known in petroleum history books. He developed a large portion of the Bradford field before joining forces with Guffey in 1880 to open the McDonald Field with the famous Matthews Gusher, the greatest of all producers until the Lucas Gusher took over supremacy. Then Galley's nose for oil led the partnership to the discovery of the Sand Fork and Kyle pools. At one time, Guffey and Galley's production was in excess of 40,000 barrels a day, establishing them as the greatest producers in the world. Even after he heard the unimaginative John D. Archbold of Standard vow he would drink every gallon of oil produced west of the Mississippi, Galley moved in to establish the Neodosha field in Kansas. When water well drillers found traces of oil in Corsicana, he moved there to develop the potential before Cullinan was called. He drilled the first wildcat in Osage County, Oklahoma, missing the Great Glen Pool by a bare half-mile, and then took the 186,000-acre lease there that Guffey sold to Theodore in Barnsdall for too little. Galley drilled in Mexico near Tampico, where he lost vast sums of money seeking the oil that was too deep for his equipment. There were few spots he missed, drilling one wildcat in the center of the Mojave Desert and another in the city limits of Washington, D.C. Out of his intrepid diggings came some of the greatest of the world's oil companies, such as Sinclair Prairie, Standard of Kansas, Barnsdall, and others, in addition to those that were born on the hill at Spindletop. Yet with all of this wealth that he helped create, he was a man with a complete disregard for money. He threw away millions in his never-ending search for oil, and regarded money only as a means to pursue his wildcatting aims. John Galley never looked over his shoulder. His serious eyes were always set straight into the future. What he made or lost yesterday was never a concern to him. The fact that there was oil on Spindletop Hill did not surprise Galley. He never looked for it in a place he didn't expect to find it, but the magnificence of the Lucas Gusher virtually overwhelmed him. It constituted a fitting climax to the most illustrious career of wildcatting in the annals of the industry. He arrived in Beaumont 3 days after the well came in. Already the town was a milling mass of humanity. Because the well had come in without warning, there had been no time to lease surrounding land on the hill or even to clear the titles of leases already made. Lucas, overcome with excitement, had failed to wrap up such tracts as the Ingalls, the Adams, the Keith Ward, the Higgins, or the scattered tracts in Gladys City, when the opportunity to do so was ripe. When Galley arrived, all of these tracts were gone, and he knew the Guffey Company was in for trouble. It was Lucas who made the first sale of oil. He entered into a contract with a company operating in Louisiana under a New Jersey charter for mining and dealing in salt, sulfur, and other minerals. The contract called for a minimum of 150 barrels of oil and an average of 2,500 barrels a day at 25 cents a barrel. The contract was signed on February 16th and called for deliveries to start on March 1st. Strange as it would seem in the years to follow, this contract was with a firm incorporated in New Jersey under the name of the Gulf Company. Within a few weeks, that company, with which Lucas had formerly been associated in his mining work in Louisiana, changed its name to the American Salt Company. Back in Pittsburgh, excitement was almost as high as it was in Beaumont. Overnight, Colonel Guffey had been transformed into the Napoleon of oil, who had risen to challenge the empire of Rockefeller. Guffey, the promoter and showman, had conveyed his enthusiasm, to some extent, to the banking firm of T. Mellon and Sons, but he had not overpowered the imperturbable Andrew W. Mellon. Day after day, Guffey made his way to the Mellon Bank, urging great sums of money to start a new company. He wanted a refinery and more wells, more miles of pipeline, millions of barrels of storage, and other facilities that the Titanic new oil discovery demanded. But Mellon was reluctant to let him have the enormous sums until all doubt had been dispelled about Spindletop. The accounts were glowing, but they were also confusing. Already the coal barons and the other oil interest had begun to underrate the Lucas Gusher. It took the Beatty well and the next 2 Guffey wells to convince Mellon. With the evidence in, Andrew Mellon and his brother Richard B. Mellon decided to help finance a corporation that would take over the holdings of the Guffey Petroleum Company. It was to be named the J.M. Guffey Petroleum Company and would be capitalized for $15 million, with 150,000 shares at $100 each, it being necessary under Texas law to pay in at least 10% of the capital in cash. It was decided that 50,000 shares would be sold for $30 each to provide $1,500,000 for the purchase of the Guffey Petroleum Company and its assets. Guffey was to get 70,000 shares, and the remaining 30,000 shares were to go into the Treasury. Guffey's plan, as discussed with Mellon, was to purchase the interest of his partners. He was to pay Galley $750,000 and Lucas $400,000. When he approached Galley, the old wildcatter permitted himself to be talked into dealing for $366,000 and a handful of loose mining stocks Guffey had in his safe. Lucas was not so easy, but finally A.W. Mellon got him to settle for $400,000 plus 1,000 shares of Guffey stock. He also agreed to keep Lucas in the company to do some additional exploration work in the Salt Dome areas, as well as in Kentucky and the southeastern states. The 50,000 shares of stock were purchased by the two Mellon brothers, who took 10,000 shares each, and by a group of prominent Pittsburgh capitalists, who each took 5,000 shares. These men were Judge James H. Reed, counsel for Carnegie Steel and the Pennsylvania Railroad, Senator William Flynn, Pittsburgh's political boss, J.D. Gallery, bank president T.H. Gibbon, manufacturer, and Joshua Rhodes, M.K. McMullen, capitalist. As the deal wound up, Guffey had 69,000 shares of stock and 734,000 cash, and was president of the new company. On May 16th, when the charter was issued for his company, the colorful colonel paid his first and only visit to Beaumont. Local newspapers described him as a man of great good humor and hospitality, with eyes that gleam with determination and quickness. Guffey told the press that his company would rank as the greatest fuel oil firm in the world, occupying the same relation to fuel oil that Standard did to illuminating oil. He offered no objection to comments on the remarkable fact that the greatest oil man in the United States, meaning Guffey, and the greatest oil field in the world had been brought together by a series of most interesting circumstances. Guffey said that because of Spindletop and his organization, the Coal Trust can well afford to be uneasy now. A few weeks later, the additional 30,000 shares of J.M. Guffey Company stock was sold at $66 to a group of new capitalists who came into great wealth by virtue of the sale of the Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, who was forming the United States Steel Company. This had the immediate effect of doubling the value of Guffey stock, giving Guffey a stock interest valued at more than $4,500,000. In June, it was realized that a separate refining company would be required. The directors decided to name the company the Texas Oil Refining Company and directed J.C. McDowell, the manager of the Guffey properties, to take out a charter in that name. McDowell replied that a name nearly like that had been preempted by the Texas Fuel Oil Company and suggested that the name Gulf be substituted. The Guffey owners believed that a name like Texas or Gulf would pay dividends in local pride and goodwill. In November, the Gulf Refining Company of Texas was chartered. The company was capitalized for $750,000, and the stock was taken largely by the same men who owned the Guffey stock. There was 150,000 shares at $5 each, and Guffey became the largest stockholder and president with 41,673 shares. Again, the second largest stockholders were Andrew and Richard Mellon, with 16,483 shares each. This company saw the addition of such names as Charles M. Schwab, Lawrence Phipps, and James Galley to the list of stockholders. Early in 1902, Guffey succeeded in talking the Mellons into floating a $5 million bond issue. The Mellon Bank took $2,500,000 of the issue and persuaded the Old Colony Trust of Boston to take $1,500,000. The other million was left unissued. During all this time, the Mellons insisted that their relationship to the company remained on a banking basis. They were reluctant to enter the oil business because they had been in it before, to their sorrow, because of a difference existing between William L. Mellon, a nephew of the Mellon brothers, and Guffey, the younger Mellon, who was a seasoned oil man, despite his youth, stayed out of the Guffey Company. He preferred to have nothing to do with Guffey's enterprises, regardless of their success, and the arrangement seemed to be all right with Guffey. It was obvious to all, however, that the business in Texas was not getting along too well. The price of oil had dropped to 3 cents, and the Guffey Company, a large producer, was suffering. William Larimer Mellon, nephew of the Mellon brothers, was in his 30s and preparing to retire from business for a much-needed rest. In August of 1902, when his Uncle Andrew walked into his office late one afternoon, the young man saw that his uncle was troubled even before he spoke a word. "Will those wells in Texas have stopped flowing?" He said, "I'm worried. Someone who knows something about oil should go down to Texas and look into this, and I think you are the one to go." Some 13 years earlier, as a young man of 20, Will Mellon had been lured by the oil business. He had spent 6 years building up a company, starting in economy field. During that period, he had learned every phase of the business. After developing properties, he had made contracts with a French purchaser that were profitable until the Pennsylvania Railroad raised its freight rates to the point where every barrel shipped represented a loss. Then a contract was made with Reading Railroad, with the result that the president was fired and the new executive refused to honor the contract. It was at that point that the pressure of Standard was recognized, or at least suspected. Will and his brothers then decided to build a pipeline to loading facilities at Marcus Hook on the Delaware River. Their troubles were untold. Fights between railroad and pipeline crews blocked the way for months. Finally, through sheer perseverance, they succeeded in reaching tidewater with the line. Their business increased with other foreign orders until the day came that Standard had enough. Mellon oil properties were sold to Standard for a profit of some $2,500,000. When the deal was over, Will Mellon agreed to spend some time with Standard, acquainting that company with his operations. It had been a most successful undertaking, but the Mellons had had their fill of the oil business and competing with the Rockefellers. At 27, Will Mellon had made a fortune and gone into the streetcar business. Now he had spent 7 successful years in that field and had sold out. He was ready for a rest when his uncle asked him to go to Texas. His report, when he returned, was gloomy. The Guffey Company was probably the most botched-up affair he had ever witnessed. The position of advantage as the field discoverer had not been properly exploited. Leases that should have been taken had been missed. Vast sums had been spent on worthless leases. Titles were in bad shape, and lawsuits by the hundreds could be expected. Much money had been squandered unnecessarily, and necessary money had not been spent. The refinery units were inadequate and required more capital to be put on an efficient basis. Oil would have to be brought in from other new fields, such as Sour Lake and Jennings. It was the opinion of the two Mellon brothers and their young nephew that the deal needed between $12 million and $15 million in new money as soon as possible. The Mellons had a bear by the tail and wanted to let go. Andrew Mellon made an engagement with Henry H. Rogers and John D. Archbold for a meeting at the Holland House in New York. Carefully and in minute detail, the situation was explained, and an offer made to turn the company over to Standard if the Mellons could recover most of their investments and those of their friends and the old Colony Trust. Now it was Rogers' turn to talk, and he was brief. "We're out," he said, "after the way Mr. Rockefeller has been treated by the state of Texas. He'll never put another dime down there, but it's all right. You have our best wishes." Now the Mellons were back in the oil business, whether they wanted to be or not, but at least Standard had given its blessing. Trouble with the Oil Trust could be avoided. William L. Mellon became the executive vice president of the J.M. Guffey Petroleum Company and the Gulf Refining Company. He took into this job many outstanding qualities, including a soaring imagination, a capacity for making good decisions, and the ability to judge men. He recognized his job from the outset and knew that to be successful, the company must have ample production. His problems were even greater than he had anticipated. For instance, he found, upon moving to Beaumont, that Guffey had made a contract in June of 1901 with the Shell Trade and Transport Company for 4,500,000 barrels of oil over a period of 20 years at 25 cents a barrel. Early in 1902, the prices had increased above that point and were rising rapidly. This contract alone could strangle the company out of existence in a short time. Something had to be done. Shell was a trading company which entered the petroleum trading field at the insistence of Colonel Guffey, who thought he had made the greatest deal of his life. The company, on the strength of the Guffey contract, had purchased tankers and other facilities for handling oil in England. Andrew Mellon made a trip to England to see the Shell officials and successfully negotiated a new contract. He convinced the Shell people that the Guffey contract would bankrupt the company and leave Shell without the oil to fulfill its own commitments. A new contract calling for a large amount of oil at a fair price over a period of 6 months was agreed upon. Shell's interest in the oil industry was born of the Lucas Gusher and Spindletop, and the future would prove the good fortune of that birth. The changes the new executive vice president had to make were bound to throw him into conflict with his old enemy, Jim Guffey. The difference between the two men had started long before Spindletop, when Guffey had taken an oil deal to the Mellon Bank. The brothers had called W.L. in for advice, and he had recommended against the Guffey proposal. Guffey was furious and thereafter blamed young Mellon every time the Mellon Bank refused him a loan. As soon as he arrived in Beaumont, Will Mellon decided that personnel changes had to be made. He let out most of the men that Guffey had put into jobs and began hiring experienced oil men and business managers. McDowell, for instance, general manager for Guffey Petroleum Company, was a politician like Guffey, although a Republican, but Mellon had problems that politicians were not capable of handling. He engaged the services of H.C. Markham, a vice president of Southern Pacific, to head the company administratively in Texas and Louisiana. Mellon found out that George H. Tabor, one of Henry Rogers' protégés, was dissatisfied in his position with Atlantic, a Standard affiliate, and hired him for the Gulf Company. Tabor was a self-taught chemist who came from an old New England whale oil family. Though irascible, he was a most competent man, and equal to the multitude of problems that Gulf's refinery faced in Port Arthur, then a small settlement some 10 miles south of Spindletop. George Craig was hired to take over production, and he brought along John H. Fisher to handle pipelines. Both were excellent men. Gale, or Nutty, was the best salesman in the business, and Mellon, knowing that getting rid of the Beaumont crude was one of his monumental tasks, engaged his services. One day, Will Mellon and his wife stepped in Beaumont for a brief visit and checked their baggage at the station. The station agent became confused and misplaced the baggage. Another man stepped up, took over the checks, and in a few minutes cleared up things with courtesy and efficiency. Mellon introduced himself and made a note of the man's name and his position. He was Frank Levy, district passenger and freight agent, who had been sent to Beaumont from New Orleans as a troubleshooter. Mellon, on the lookout for good men, hired Levy, who later rose to the vice presidency of the Gulf Oil Corporation. With these men as a nucleus, Mellon began to make some progress with his company. He was receiving terrific competition from the Texas Company, Sun, Higgins, Haywood, and others, including the Burt Refinery, a company that he strongly suspected of being Standard in spite of Mr. Rockefeller's determination to stay out of Texas. But under experienced and forceful leadership, Gulf and Guffey continued to improve. As the days passed into weeks and months and years, Mellon continued to wrestle with the Hill and the other fields that had come into being after Lucas had shown the way with his nascent dome theory. Guffey, bad manager that he was, continued at the head of the company and was a constant obstacle to Will Mellon. In the meantime, his money affairs had gone bad, and he owed the Mellon Bank alone more than $1 million in principal and unpaid interest. He owed much more to other Pittsburgh banks. The Mellon Bank held 24,000 shares of Guffey stock as collateral. In 1907, when the Glen pool came in Oklahoma, Will Mellon saw the chance to make the Guffey and Gulf properties highly profitable. If they could build a pipeline from Oklahoma to the Gulf, in spite of the protest of Guffey, the company was reorganized again, and the Gulf Oil Corporation took over the J.M. Guffey Petroleum Company, the Gulf Refining Company of Texas, and the recently created Gulf Pipeline Company. The Gulf Oil Corporation was capitalized for $15 million, and authority was voted to float $15 million in bonds. Guffey Miffed decided to get out and was paid more than $2,500,000 for his stock interest. The Mellon Bank, the Old Colony Trust, and other creditors were paid off. Andrew W. Mellon was happy again. He was president of the new company for 2 years. In 1909, his nephew took over the job to hold it for the next 35 years, during which time it would become one of the great petroleum enterprises of the world. Within a short time after the sale, Guffey found himself in the hands of receivers. He had tried to corner the coal market and had met with dismal failure. Galley, the great old wild-catter, continued to stick his inquiring nose into oil sands. Like most wild-catters, he spent all he made seeking hidden reserves. His last days were spent with his favorite nephew, Thomas M. Galley, who traveled over the continent with him. John Galley's last venture was financed by Al Hamel, his old driller from Corsicana and Beaumont. The day it failed and the two parted company, Galley confided to Hamel that he was poorer than he had ever been in his entire lifetime. John Galley died at Joplin, Missouri in 1912, still looking for oil. Old Colonel Guffey came to the funeral, looked at John Galley for the last time, and recalled how John had led him into the greatest oil discovery of the world's history. "Lillian," he said to Galley's wife, "we are burying the best man I've ever known."